Today, we're going to be presenting about building a bridge between heritage and second language learners, the pedagogical approaches to foster collaboration and reciprocal learning.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for being here and for attending our presentation. Before we start actually talking about the work that we want to present, we want to give you a little bit of background of what we do in our programs. As I mentioned before, my name is Torre De Babel, and I am the director of the Spanish second language program here at the University of Washington. For those of you who are not familiarized with the program, this is a program organized in 3 levels, 3 years, and it's a program intended for second language learners. The curriculum has been designed with the second language learner in mind, and the textbook that we use, like most first-year textbooks, are textbooks for second language learners. However, in this program, we also have a small, but I would say increasing number of heritage language learners who choose to enroll in the L2 program, even though we also have a heritage language program for a variety of reasons, but mostly because they don't have, or they feel they don't have, the skills to enter the heritage language program, which in our case starts in the second year at the intermediate level. These heritage language learners have a strong cultural connection to the language, but their knowledge of the language varies a lot. Some of them only have receptive skills, and those who can speak usually have very or relatively limited productive abilities. They take these courses because they are not fluent enough yet for the heritage language program. But most importantly, they represent a really small percentage of the students in the classroom. So we are talking about maybe 2-3 students in a classroom with 20-25 students. So the challenge that we have in our program is how to integrate the needs, the linguistic and affective needs of these heritage language learners, how to integrate their home variety, how to integrate their culture when they represent such a small percentage of the students in the classrooms, and when the resources that we have available, such as the textbook and teaching materials, have not been designed for this purpose, because there are no materials for mixed classes. Materials are for second language classes or heritage language classes. So that's the situation in our L2 program, and now Angelica will talk about our HL program.
As we continue to grow the heritage language program, at the moment, we don't have heritage language classes offered in the first year. And these are classes needed for receptive students, as mentioned, as Anna mentioned. These are students who have a cultural connection to the language. So many students have only option in 1 course in the second year level, and also 3 courses in the third year level. But there's 3 main reasons as to why students don't enroll in the heritage language track. One is that they are not aware of this option. And Anna and I are working together to be able to expose more for students, incoming freshmen, for instance, to know about this option. 2 is that many times, also as Anna mentioned, many times these students feel that they're lacking a lot of grammar. So they feel that, oh, I need to start from level 1 to be able to increase my proficiency in Spanish, because as all of you have heard, is that many times these students are told they don't speak good Spanish, they don't know anything about the grammar, so their confidence in the language tends to be really low. So they say, okay, I'm gonna start from the first level. But in reality, they need to be interviewed and they need to be accessed to be able to see, okay, what's the best level for you? And then the third level, and the third option is that here in UW, we have the option of having 2 different tracks, but in reality, many of these students were never given the option to take these heritage language classes. So it's the first time, if they're in a class, is the first time that they are taking something similar like this. So it could be intimidating. So they prefer not to, they continue to stay in the second language track. Next. On the left-hand side, most of you are familiar with the ACFO learning goals, and that is communication, cultures, connection, comparison, and communities. On the right-hand side, I'm gonna show you the goals for heritage language teaching. And the reason of showing you this is because I want to point out that there's a lot of overlap with these different types of research, of these different types of goals, right? For instance, number one, language maintenance goes hand in hand with, we want students to effectively communicate with the language, and that goes with A and E. We also want students to be able to participate in multilingual communities and be able to use the language beyond the home. And to be able to meet these goals, one of the next slide, what we're proposing is that the pedagogical approaches that we can use are, for instance, as our keynote speaker mentioned, differential instruction. As you can see here in the photo, every student, regardless if it's L2 or heritage student, all of them have different needs. So this is a pedagogical approach that should be implemented in all classes regarding of the type of students. And the other approach is top-down instruction, where we need to recognize what is the knowledge that students bring into the classroom. And starting from that get-go, it's gonna not only acknowledge or validate the student, but also make them feel that, oh, I'm not coming here to be filling with knowledge, right? It's like, okay, I'm here to grow what I already know or what I'm being exposed to. Because, and then eventually our main goal in pedagogical approaches, which is the next click, is that we want to build and develop classes that are student-centered. And what Anna and I are going to be presenting to you are going to be different activities that are going to talk about how to build vocabulary, how do we reinforce the writing skill, how do we reinforce the reading skills, and also how do we reinforce speaking skills in classes that are mixed, both with heritage language students and second language students.
So as I mentioned from the beginning, from my perspective, the perspective of the second language program, the main challenge is how to integrate the needs of the heritage language learner when the textbook and the resources that we have been designed for second language learners, which I imagine it's a common situation at most levels, most languages, that you have classes with a mix of heritage and L2 learners, and your book is either designed for second language learners or for heritage language learners. In my case, it's a book for second language learners. So what I'm going to present now are a few examples of how I have adapted the activities in our textbook, the textbook of our first year L2 program, to incorporate the needs of the heritage language learner, and also to try to leverage the complementary skills of the heritage and second language learners to try to make the most of the situation by fostering collaboration and reciprocal learning, by building that bridge that we mentioned at the very beginning. So I'm going to start with vocabulary activities, okay? So, in terms of vocabulary, we know that heritage language learners are mostly familiar with home vocabulary, the everyday vocabulary that we use at home. And we know that for them, knowing a word does not necessarily mean knowing how to write it. For second language learners, on the other hand, we know that they are mostly familiar with academic and formal vocabulary, that is the vocabulary in the textbook, and that when they learn a new word, typically they learn how to pronounce it and how to write it at the same time. The challenge for them is spontaneous production, that is using this vocabulary in a spontaneous, authentic communication. In the case of Spanish, but I imagine that's also true for other heritage languages talked in our state and in other states, a major challenge for us as teachers is the fact that the vocabulary presented in the textbook often does not reflect the heritage language learners' home variety. First year textbooks typically present just one word for one concept or idea or reference, because the goal is not to overwhelm the second language learner, but this means that they don't represent the rich variety of the Spanish language, and what is worse, that usually they don't represent the variety of the languages, of the different languages, the different varieties of languages that the different heritage language in our classes use at home. in the case of Spanish, but I know this is true for other high-touch languages, there are two topics that appear in every first-year book, and that where there's a lot of lexical variation, and those two topics are clothing and food. So I'm going to start with an example from clothing, okay? Our textbook uses a video to introduce the topic of clothing, to introduce the names of clothes, accessories, and all that. And you can see here the activity as it appears in the textbook. So you have a screenshot of the video, we have some comprehension questions, and then we have a sequence of activities to be completed in pairs and small groups. And those are the activities that I have changed, that I have adapted for my mixed groups of second and heritage language learners. The textbook asks learners to work in pairs. Instead, I have introduced an initial phase in which students work individually, and each learner works on their own needs and faces their own challenges. So for instance, in step 1, I ask the heritage language learner to read the script while the second language learner can watch the video. Our textbook is online, so it allows for this. So here the heritage language learner is working on their literacy skills, while the L2 learner is working on their listening skills. The next step, step 2, asks the heritage language learner to compare the vocabulary in the video, in the textbook, with the vocabulary that they use at home. So this activity has two main purposes. First, it offers an opportunity for the HL learner to increase their vocabulary, to incorporate new words. But most importantly for me, it introduces an opportunity to integrate in the classroom the home vocabulary of the HL learner. I'm going to talk in a moment more about that. In the meantime, the L2 learner is working on their own vocabulary problems, which presumably will be different from those of the HL learner. And once each learner has worked on their own needs, that's when they come together to work in pairs. And here, this is designed for an HL2 pair of learners, but if you have an unbalanced number of heritage and second language learners, as is our case, this activity can also be done in a pair of 2 second language learners. It has been designed with that goal in mind. So here, in this second phase, when each learner has worked on their own needs, the 2 learners are first asked to share their words and to help each other. The idea here is that if they can help each other, they help each other. If they need extra help, then this is the moment to use a dictionary. And once they have done that, we move to step 4, where I ask them to share with the rest of the class. I said, share with the rest of the class those names of clothing items and accessories that you have in your list, but do not appear in the video. And here, the goal is the moment when the home words of the heritage language learner become the classroom words. So here, the goal is to incorporate the home variety of the learner, to incorporate it and to validate it. And to validate it means that we need to give to those words this exact same status as the variety presented in the textbook. So it means that those words need to be treated in exactly the same way as we treat the vocabulary, the list of words that appear in the textbook. They need to be part of the contents of the chapter. They need to be part of the words the students are being tested on, ideally. And because we treat it at the same level, that's why in step 5 we ask both learners, HL and L2 learners, to use all these words, to use the words that are new for the second language learner, the words that are new for the HL learner, and the words that the HL learner uses at home and has now shared with the rest of the class. So just to summarize, what I have done here is, with a relatively small adaptation of an activity in the textbook, using the textbook as the starting point, using the resources that the textbook offers to us, like the video and the images and the list of words, I have made this relatively easy adaptation that has allowed me to incorporate and validate the home vocabulary and the home varieties of the heritage language learners in the classroom, that has allowed me to create opportunities for learners to work on their own needs, but also to work together, to collaborate, to share their different sources of knowledge. What I'm trying to do here is using what Maria Carrera in her publications has referred to as flexible grouping in order to leverage the complementary skills of the heritage and the second language learners for reciprocal learning. I'm going to go very briefly or more briefly through this second example. This is now about food. I'm presenting this example just to illustrate how this same approach that I have used with the clothing activity can be applied to other vocabulary activities, and not just the activities in my textbook, but I'm sure also many of the activities in your textbooks, in your classes, wherever the level, wherever the language. Here we are talking about food. This is the activity, again, this is the activity in the textbook. A text introduces the new vocabulary. Students are asked to work in pairs. And this is how I have adapted it. So first, heritage and second language learners work independently, focusing on their own needs, on what they already know and what they need to learn before they come together to work as a pair. And then we have the pair, the mixed diet activities. Here I have also introduced a cultural component. So for instance, in step 3, I asked the heritage learners in the classroom to identify the main ingredients of the gastronomy of their community. And I did it on purpose because I want them to decide, I want the learner to decide which community is this, with which community they identify. But the goal here is to introduce not just the language variety of the heritage language learner, but also their cultural variety, their home culture, their heritage. And then in step 4, again, they compare, they work in pairs. And in step 5 and 6, I'm asking them to find a Latino grocery store online, to plan a trip to the store, and to write a review together based on what they have observed. So things like, what products do they offer? Products that you cannot find in a safe way. Is Spanish used in the store? Are there signs in Spanish? Do the customer, do the assistants speak Spanish? And the goal here is to take the language out of the classroom. The goal here is to raise our learners' awareness, both heritage and second language learners' awareness about the presence and the use of the language around us. And Maria has provided like awesome statistics about like how many people around us speak these languages. So the goal here is to deforeignize the language. Spanish textbooks, textbooks intended for second language learners, they always present the Spanish language as a foreign language, as something that you will use when you travel abroad. But the truth is that you don't need to travel abroad to use Spanish or Mandarin or Japanese. You don't need to travel abroad to experience the Hispanic or Chinese or Vietnamese culture. You can use the language here, and that's true in Seattle, but it's true in most parts of the country, and that's true for Spanish, but it's true for many of the heritage language that we use. So that's the idea behind these activities. And of course, again, this is an activity that you can do with a mixed diet of heritage and a second language learner, or 2 second language learners. And the goal here for me was to incorporate and validate not just the language, but also the culture of the heritage language learners in the classroom, to legitimize the local communities, to showcase the use of the heritage language, be it Spanish, Mandarin, Japanese, in the US, in order to deforeignize what Tecedor and Pascual y Cabo are now calling deforeignizing the language curriculum, to take the language out of and beyond the classroom. And as always, as we saw in the previous examples, always creating opportunities for learners to work individually and opportunities for learners to work in pairs, and tasks designed to encourage this collaboration and reciprocal learning. So I'm going to move now to writing. Then in the Q&A, if you have questions about the vocabulary activities, or if you want me to share my slides, I will be happy. But I want to have reserve a few minutes to talk about writing, since writing is particularly challenging for heritage language learners. We know that heritage language learners tend to have strong oral skills, but more limited writing skills, and they have difficulties with orthography, in some cases with the alphabet, in other cases, like for Spanish, with accentuation. Second language learners, on the other hand, feel more comfortable writing than speaking, because in writing they have time to think, and they have more explicit knowledge of grammar. That is, they know the rules, but they don't always know how to apply them. And again, a main challenge, at least for Spanish, is the fact that the textbooks do not reflect the heritage language learners' variety of the language. The textbooks show an academic standard variety of the language, when our students, our heritage language learners, typically speak non-standard varieties and often stigmatized varieties of the language. So one of the things that we see here, and that has been pointed out before by researchers, scholars, has been pointed out before by Maria Carrera in her publications, is the fact that, yes, heritage and second language learners have different needs, but they also have different strengths. And what is more important, these different strengths actually complement each other. That is, the strengths of the heritage language learner are the weaknesses of the L2 learner, and the other way around, which means that when enrolled in the same class, when working together, there's also a lot of potential for reciprocal learning, for the HL to learn from the L2 and the L2 to learn from the HL, kind of like what we have been talking so far. And writing is the one area where we know, because we have research that has documented it, that we can take good advantage of this, that we can design writing activities to push heritage and second language learners to pull their different sources of knowledge, to pull their complementary skills and strengths so they can both learn from each other. And one way of achieving this is through the use of collaborative writing activities, collaborative writing tasks. Collaborative writing tasks, oops, sorry, something happened. Can you see my PowerPoint now? No, yeah, something happened and I don't know what it was.
I think maybe it quit PowerPoint. You might have to reopen it. That happened to me last week.
Yeah, I touched the wrong. 1 second, sorry about that. Okay, are we okay now?
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. Okay, so as I was saying, one way of doing this is through the use of collaborative writing tasks. And I'm going to explain what I mean by a collaborative writing task. A collaborative writing task is a task, an activity in which 2 or more learners work together to produce one joint test. We have 2 learners, 1 test. They collaborate through the entire writing process and they share ownership of the final product. So it's not a typical divide and conquer approach that most of our learners adopt when we assign a group project and we leave them on their own. The idea here is that they are working together through all the phases of the writing process. That's why we typically want to do these activities, if possible, in the classroom during the class time. And they collaborate in the planning, they collaborate in the writing, and they collaborate in the editing of their tests. And they can be done again in groups of 2, in pairs of 2 learners, 2 each learners. But when we have the opportunity of mixing an HL and an L2 learner, we want to assign the scribe role to the HL learner. That is, the 2 learners are going to talk together when they are working together in this task. They need to decide together what they want to say and how they want to say it. But one of them has to actually write down the test. And in this case, we want to assign that role to the HL learner precisely because writing is particularly challenging for the heritage language learner. And the idea here is that when writing the test, when physically writing the test, the HL learner will encounter difficulties. They will not know how to spell a word or how to accentuate every word. And that's when they are going to need the help from the second language learner. And that's precisely the goal of collaborative writing tasks, to push learners to collaborate in the solution of their language-related problems. So these 2 examples here illustrate kind of like what I'm trying to say. In the first example, the L2 learner helps the HL learner because the HL learner missed an accent and the L2 learner notices it and points it out. And so they fix the problem. In the second example, the HL learner helps the second language learner with a vocabulary problem. So the beauty of this is that virtually any task, any writing task can be transformed into a collaborative writing task. You just need to ask your students to work in pairs or in a group of 3, a small group. And it doesn't need to be a huge assignment or anything like that. It can be a moment in every class, in every sequence of class, or it can be a moment or a step in a sequence of activities, which is precisely what we saw in the example that I presented here before, the 2 sequences of activities. culminate with a collaborative writing activity where students can pull together what they have learned in the previous steps and help each other solve their language-related problems and help each other to build new language knowledge. And we can move now to reading. We cannot hear
In the
you.
next slide, points out what is it that we know about reading in terms of the weaknesses and strengths of each student. We know that the heritage language typically develops home literacy practices, and this we could see, for instance, Latinx students translating, I don't know, bills or documents that the parents receive in the mail. There tends to be a lower motivation, but they do have the sociocultural background to be able to understand some of the information in some of the readings. What is it that we know in the about the L2 student? We know that in these classes, they tend to be exposed to more diverse genres. However, both type of students face many challenges in terms of reading. And one is that many times they're not exposed to what are some reading strategies that they can help them understand or comprehend the content. And most of the time, they have readings that do not highlight their linguistic and cultural backgrounds. And in some cases, students tend to be really hesitant to reading, right? Similar to if many times they don't read in their first language, what's going to push them to be able to read in Spanish? So we want to be able to, one of the biggest challenges is we want students to read beyond the classroom. And so then hopefully with some of the recommendations we're going to be able to provide you next is that we move students from reading in the classroom to hopefully end up reading or are intrigued to read for fun beyond the classroom. So we go on the next slide. And one of the recommendations we have is that we must incorporate readings that are authentic or that are relevant to their lives. And one of the topics we're going to talk about today is bilingualism and diversity. And we recommend also to implement scaffolding activities that lead to higher level thinking. And this is very important because sometimes if we think about our own life experience, many times we tend to read a text more than once, right? And that's important to understand that when we ask a student, whether it's a heritage or an L2 student, they're not going to be able to understand the first time they are exposed to that reading, right? We need to walk them through the different steps to be able to lead to that comprehension. So the reading that we have chose for this activity is a reading that comes from a heritage language book. Next. That talks about language diversity and bilingualism. And I know that you cannot necessarily read the entire text, but I'm going to give you a small summary of what the content of this reading is about. The title is La Torre De Babel, and it talks about Latinx experiences or Hispanic experiences with language diversity. In the first 3 paragraphs, we talk about somebody, it talks about somebody that it's confronts language discrimination in society. One is either in their job, they're prohibited to speak Spanish, and the other one under luchas en la familia, the tia abuela does not communicate with the speaker because the speaker is speaking Spanish, but then the tia abuela speaks Catalan. So in a way, the tia abuela does not respond because pretty much saying like, wait, you're speaking Catalan, you're not speaking Spanish, I'm not gonna interact with you. So they are ignored. And in Una Paradoja, it talks about this paradox in society, in the US society, where there's so many language diversity, as we saw in the keynote speaker, but then yet this language diversity is not promoted in the US. And many times students get to take language classes only until they get into high school. So one of the activities that we can do to be able to engage students in this reading, in the next slide, we're gonna be able to see that we can pair heritage language students and L2 students. And given that we know what are the needs of both students, we're gonna have the L2 student read aloud the reading. Both of the students will discuss and understand the reading, and the heritage language student will write down the answers for the comprehension question. Parallel to assigning these tasks, it's important to, before they start doing any of these tasks, we expose students. If you click on the next step, we need to expose students to what are some strategies that they can use when approaching a reading. And we want students to do a pre-reading during the reading activity and post-reading activity. In the next slide, I'm gonna give you some examples of what I mean with pre-lectura. We want to be able to activate students' understanding or conocimiento about the topic. So students can try to look at the title, look at the subtitles, and try to, or even if the reading has some illustrations, try to understand what is the article about, or what is this reading about, just based on the titles, on the subtitles, or even the photos. During the reading, we can engage students in scanning and skimming the reading, but also in pointing out what is the new vocabulary. And rather than having students look at the new vocabulary in the dictionary, we want students to be able to use the context of the reading to be able to interpret the meaning. And we also want students to ask and engage with the reading by asking questions either on the margins. We want students to be able to highlight and write also down the important ideas. So then once they engage in all these different steps, once they completed the reading, then we can have students either summarizing the reading, we can have them answer comprehension questions or anything that they learned, and also having them reflect on the reading. So if we go on the next slide, here, maybe the students are not gonna be able to understand what La Torre de Babel is. They maybe some of them would know what Torre de Babel is referring to, and they can get an idea. But then after that, lucha en la familia en una paradoja could be like, okay, what does this have to do with La Torre de Babel? So students, before even starting to read, they can start activating this knowledge, right? And this curiosity, hopefully, to be able to read this. In the next slide, by engaging students with authentic text and this scaffolding, hopefully students are motivated to read outside of the classroom. And one day they're gonna be I'm gonna be able to read in Spanish just for fun, right? We want students to, by engaging them in these strategies, we want them to increase their engagement. We want them to learn new vocabulary. We also need to consider in how can we expose students to the diverse genres of literature, right? From narrations, from autobiographies, from if we go more abstract to, I don't know, something de Gabriel Garcia Marquez, no? And also we want students to develop these literacy skills. And it's important to understand that these literacy skills could not only be applied to Spanish classes, but these are skills that could be transferred to other content classes. And it's important to understand that our language classes can have more impactful aspects or factors to our students beyond the language. Many times students don't know how to even approach these readings, but by engaging them in these literacy skills could help them in other classes. And by incorporating live readings that are from real life experiences, such as bilingualism and language diversity, we would engage students in developing their critical thinking. For instance, bilingualism and language diversity could talk about why is the US not promoting bilingualism, right? And then in the next slide, let's talk about speaking. And we need to understand, in the next slide, we need to understand that, yes, many heritage language students might have grown listening to Spanish, but many times these heritage language students don't feel confident speaking Spanish, right? And this is because of everything, maybe the way they've been told about their Spanish, the way that they've been approached when they take Spanish. If somebody is like telling them like, wait, I don't understand you, many times that's going to lead them to not use the language and also feel less confident when speaking the language. And what we also know about the L2 student is that many times they don't get a chance to practice their language, right? Because there's a lot of big emphasis in writing and listening. But, and many times they don't know much about language diversity, where there tends to be just one variety. And many times the prestige varieties are taught in the Spanish courses. And the biggest challenge overall when we talk about speaking abilities and speaking activities in the class is that many times students have this societal pressure and expectations to sound like. In the heritage language student and the L2 student, they need to sound native like, right? And because of they have that self-doubt, they prefer not to be able to speak. So some of the activities that we can implement in our classes are the following. Are either structure open discussion and structure informal activities. And why is it important to understand the importance of having these steps? Because we want to be able to, given that many students don't feel confident, we need to scaffold them to be able to feel that they have the knowledge to be able to speak about the content, right? So in the first structure activity, we can engage students in role plays where they can write a script about, for instance, in groups. The heritage language student will talk about any miscommunication situation that they confronted. And once they have the script, they could feel comfortable with, okay, I know about the vocabulary that I can use. I know the content the content that we're talking about. So it's going to be more likely that they're going to engage in and be able to speak with a lot less intimidation. And this is activities that I paired with the reading. So the reading helped students prepare for these activities. Then we can go after to the open discussions. And with the open discussions, we can ask more broader questions. For instance, we can ask heritage language students to talk about whether they're related to any information mentioned in their reading, the Torre De Babel. Have they ever encountered a family member fronting them, like any family member telling them, wait, you don't speak Spanish, why are you talking to me in English? And also the L2 student can talk about the paradox in US regarding bilingualism, right? What would have happened if they had taken language classes since they were in elementary? What about if they were in middle school? Why did they have to wait until they were in high school? And then once they have engaged within these topics through different structure activities, then we can ask them to prepare a more structured and more formal presentation about bilingualism or diversity. And only once we do that and we have this scaffolding activities, we hope that in the next slide, that students are able to build and increase the linguistic confidence and be able to increase their functional proficiency. We want students to be able to use Spanish beyond the classroom. But in order for us to be able to encourage them to use Spanish beyond the classroom, we need to help them. We need to prepare them. And by that, once we prepare them, it's going to be more likely that they're going to expand their social networks. Spanish is not only going to be spoken in the classroom or at the home. It could be, hopefully we encourage them to speak it in the stores. Hopefully we encourage them to speak it on social media. And eventually what we want to promote, if you recall in the goals that I presented to you at the beginning, we want to promote Spanish maintenance.
So in order to conclude, rather than summarize what we have said and boring you with a repetition of what we have said, we want to share with you, we want to share with you some comments from our learners, some comments from our HL and L2 learners. These are students from our program. These are third-year students, so they have a relatively advanced level. This comes from a few years ago, and So it was a project to teach together heritage and second language learners in the same class. It was a project led by 2 faculty members in my department, one from the HL program, Maria Gilman, and one from the L2 program, Jorge Gonzalez, with a curriculum specifically designed to leverage the skills and knowledge of the HL and L2 learners. And we can see here that HL learners, heritage language learners, recognize that second language learners were better than them with things like orthography, and they recognize that they benefited linguistically from working with L2 learners. They say things like, I was better at the vocabulary, but needed some extra help on accents, or the L2 learners seem to know some of the spelling and grammar rules much better than me. The second language learners also noticed that they had benefited from the heritage language learners' knowledge, particularly in terms of vocabulary. They say things like, heritage language learners were always happy to answer my how do you say questions. It really helped me. It really helped my vocabulary. But most importantly, their perceptions of the benefits of working together went beyond linguistic needs. The experience was a confidence booster for both of them. So the second language learners, they generally, as I said, this is third year learners, they generally perceive the heritage language learners as native speakers and value the opportunity to interact with the native speakers in the classroom. So they say things like, I benefited from hearing native speakers use their language, from the exposure to how things are actually written or said in Spanish as opposed to the language in the textbook. It made me feel more confident speaking to an actual Spanish speaker. And the heritage language learners too, for them, it was definitely a confidence booster experience. They enjoyed the opportunity of being able to help, to teach their L2 partners. They made comments like, the main benefit was how much I was able to teach them. They enjoyed the opportunity to share their knowledge of the Latinx culture. They say things like, sometimes they did not know very much about the culture, but they gave me the opportunity to share some of my knowledge. And overall, they felt pushed to perform at a higher level when working with the second language learners. One of them specifically said, I felt like expectations were higher, so I would put more effort in the assignment. And given that linguistic confidence, or I should say lack of linguistic confidence, is a major problem for our heritage language learners, I think, or I would argue that these benefits are as important as the linguistic benefits that we have seen. And that's all. I believe we have about only 5 minutes for questions, but we will be here during the networking event, so you can ask questions. You can contact us via email. And again, if you want to, if you're interested in our presentation, we will be happy to share our slides, our email addresses on the slides. And now, yeah, I don't know if there are any questions. Russ, do we have time for questions? Or?
Yeah, it looks like we have 5 minutes. So if anyone wants to add the questions to the shared Google Doc, or you could submit the questions through the Q&A, although it does look like Michelle has a question.
Michelle has a question.
Let her jump in.
So I just wanted to say there were several questions in the that were put with the registrations that I responded to or I started responses, I should say, in the shared Google Doc. And I don't know, Russ, am I able to share that screen? I'm not doing screen sharing, but maybe you could open it, because they had a lot of questions about how to deal with mixed groups. And you have such concrete suggestions and proven things with your surveys, Anna, I think, about how the students really feel about it. It seems that, of course, it feels more challenging to have that huge range of proficiency with like beginning or early learners of that are L2 plus heritage speakers. But it sounds like if you can make lemonade out of lemons, you can actually create a really robust environment. So I just wanted to say, maybe you guys can look later and add some more points, but I would encourage anybody that posted those questions in the registration forms originally, and I will send out that link again to remind everybody to go look for responses there, that there are ways, I mean, and there's a lot of reasons why creating a separate heritage language track and then trying to force people into it might not be the best decision either.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And we do have one question here that just came through. I'll read that, which is from an anonymous attendee. I teach interpreting translation courses, and most of my students are generation 1.5. What would be the best way to teach these college students that lack academic medical vocabulary, lack high register, and also idiomaticity?
Angelica, you want to answer that?
Great question. I think it's important to understand that vocabulary needs to be learned within a context, right? That's when we understand that students were able to acquire more of that vocabulary. So then what I recommend, instead of having them necessarily like isolated words that they learned, implement it like through a reading, implement it through a discussion, and just expose them to all this language, to all this different terminology. Because I think I myself wouldn't be able to, I go to the doctor, but I'm not necessarily familiar with all this technical medical terminology. So then making them that explicit step to be able to teach this vocabulary, but as I mentioned before, within the context, expose them to the vocabulary through different ways, through reading, through discussions, through giving them activities that they can be able to implement eventually. That's how they're going to eventually be able to acquire it and be able to use it. Anna, do you have any other suggestion? And the fact that the course is built for that topic, it's great, because then you can create a module just building vocabulary on that's going to help them with their career.
Mm-hmm. No, and Angelica and I have been talking about this difference between the bottom-up, top-down approaches, and how I do believe that even for second language learners, that it's good to start with a test, like kind of like what we presented, with a test that incorporates the vocabulary, a video, some kind of contest. That's important not only for heritage language learners, but also for second language learners, rather than try to memorize vocabulary or list of words in isolation. So yeah, definitely there's a lot of research and publications about how heritage language learners need to be presented new vocabulary in context. But I will say that that's also true for second language learners. It's difficult, like at the beginning when they have very limited knowledge, but definitely like the level that you're talking about, since they are learning to be translators. Yeah, I do agree with what Angelica has said, and I would just add that I believe that's true for both heritage and second language learners.
We have another question from Eduardo that says, do you think L2 textbooks could incorporate some of these strategies?
Yes.
Yes, I want to say that it's tricky with textbooks, because I think textbooks are a little bit outdated. I don't want to say outdated, but I think they're really behind. Many times they don't incorporate linguistic research as to how to learn the language. So definitely they should be able to incorporate them. And I'm not sure.
Textbook,
yes.
Sorry. But a textbook is never going to be the solution, because each class is different and each heritage language learner is different and the balance of activities are different. But yeah, they could incorporate some at least strategies or tips for the teacher. But again, they are never going to be the solution to all our problems. In the same way that having a separate heritage language program is never going to be the solution to all our problems, because we will always still have heritage language learners taking classes alongside second language learners. But yeah, if somebody is thinking about creating a new textbook, please try to do that.
And when Anna and I were talking about this presentation, we decided that we wanted to take activities from a textbook and be able to show you how to modify them, because that's the reality, right? We have these textbooks and we need to work with these. So how could we modify them to be able to implement the needs of both type of students? So, Eduardo? Are you up for the challenge? Create a new textbook.